Greetings, this is the Question GM and RPG A Day 2020, day number 19, and the word of the day is tower. So when we think tower, most typically in a fantasy RPG, we think the wizard's tower and what are the dangers therein, or the evil ambitions that the wizard has, or maybe even the benevolent ambitions wizard may have to call for the aid or to be slain by the adventuring party. But I think I want to take tower in a slightly different direction. And it's been something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and I believe this idea is not entirely original, or probably has occurred to somebody at some point, if in a fantasy role-playing game. And the idea is the tower dungeon, a very simple flip of the typical idea of a dungeon, which is usually underground and it goes multiple layers below ground, and you deeper and deeper into the dungeon and then find their way back up again when they need to resupply or need to gain restful rest before they can recover their resources and then go back down again. The inverse idea here is to have a dungeon that is built outwards, and therefore we have the idea of the tower dungeon. And this is not an idea that I wouldn't say is strictly tied to fantasy role-playing games. I think there are definitely more modern or sci-fi settings that actually have utilized this idea. In movies, there are definitely some inspirations from that. Some of our more recent examples would be The Raid, the Indonesian action flick, which is basically a just a walk straight up to the final boss in the end for a final showdown, which is one of your typical video game slash action movie kind of setting of having the main villain at the top level of the tower. And that actually brings up another point. Another very famous tower would be the one from Die Hard. That's a tower dungeon in itself, where the PCs have to navigate layer upon layer to go to reach the top, where where the final showdown is. Very similar to The Raid, we have the new Judge Dredd remake, which is also also set in a tower. Game basically has the entire tower at their disposal. And another very famous movie reference probably is Bruce Lee's Game of Death, the unfinished Game of Death, which is also set in the idea of every layer that Bruce Lee's character goes up, he has to fight another martial artist and eventually supposedly reaches the top until his a very untimely death. The idea of towers is something that's not, I wouldn't say it's original at this point, but I think it presents some interesting subversions, you could say, to your traditional underground dungeon. For one, I think the idea is that for a tower dungeon, the idea is the presence of it. Players can see the tower and they can see how high it goes, so they know actually to climb up the tower. There is obviously some different challenges or different questions that the GM has to respond to. Is that why can't the players just climb the exterior of the tower to reach the top rather than having to go through the layers in the interior? So but that's definitely a lot of opportunity for the DM to really exercise a bit of their creative muscles to really think up of some really nasty traps or defense mechanisms that that's on the exterior of the tower and therefore cannot be taken down from the outside. Like burning the tower or so forth. So scale is obviously one very imposing thing about tower dungeons compared to your unseen and buried dungeon. When you have scale, it adds a lot to the mythical or mythological presence of the tower, and therefore a lot of legend can swirl within it. So I guess one good example, or you could say one tower that has some mythological resonance would be the Tower of Babel from the Bible. And the tower, the construction of the tower itself, or the presence of the tower itself, could be a representation or a metaphor for something more on a mythological scale. In the case of the Tower of Babel, it was probably human hubris, and that could be the mythological origins of the tower, of why do you have a tower dungeon, because it represented something in the world. So it's actually can be a very interesting or a central pillar to your world building that is built around the tower. On a natural progression of the world building would be to say, let's probably incites or attracts different kinds of society or economy to be built around it. That sort of adds to the world building. A city could be built around the tower to facilitate for adventuring activities. A certain kind of politics, a certain kind of culture, a certain kind of society can be built around adventuring towers. a certain kind, and therefore that brings the whole idea of, you know, the usual complications of having cities in an urban environment, but which is built around a central dungeon. And a good example of this would probably be Waterdeep from Forgotten Realms, but you know, that's built on top of a massive dungeon. But you know, it can be easily reversed to be built around a central tower, because you know, towers go all the way up. It's a natural progression of how the levels can be. You know, each level of the tower could represent one level of play, you know, or tier of play in the D&D terminology. Or you know, it can be just a construction of how an inner world can be built inside a massive building. That's also probably one of the common tropes of when you see fantasy based, you know, towers, and that's tower dungeons and that sort of thing. This is probably my biggest inspiration for tower dungeons. It's actually from an anime, and I believe the anime itself is based on a video game series called the Tower of Droga. And if you watch the you know, both seasons of the anime, you will actually get to see a very interesting take on tower dungeons. You know, it started off plainly just about being able to travel to the top, and you know, reaching the top usually achieve some sort of very mystical goal. It can be, for in D&D terms, it could be just as simple as a wish spell. It could be a very powerful artifact that's on top of it. It could be a very powerful villain that resides on top of it, and therefore raining terror down on whoever's below the tower, which can be a very simple and yet, you know, motivating plot device to just to get players to get motivated to go into the tower. But they also deal with more of the plausible factors that it comes into having a setting centered on a tower dungeon. Why can't the kingdom just send an army down the dungeon? Or maybe the tower itself is so filled with riches that it actually builds a adventuring economy around it, that some people don't really have intentions to go to the top of the tower, but more about just going into the dungeon constantly just to pillage for its riches. Leads into some rather unscrupulous practices and, you know, ethical quandaries when it comes to using the tower dungeon for your exploitation rather than for your expeditions and that sort of things, for your heroics. Tower dungeons, like I said, are really a very simple yet very dynamic take of your typical dungeon, and encourage anyone to explore that idea. And you know, it's a very simple campaign setting in itself. It's pretty self-contained, and it's definitely one that I've been trying to do, but I think it's something that, you know, has to be really built from the ground up. And because I have not encountered any familiar setting that actually takes this concept, you know, and really develops it to a real full range, really see the potentials of tower dungeons compared to your underground dungeon. And maybe there's no real Western perception towards tower dungeons compared to everyone still prefers their dungeons to be underground, but I definitely would like to see, you know, someone take an idea of a tower dungeon and really flesh it out to its full potential and really see where this can go. I guess that'll be all for RPG A Day 2020 for day 19, and I will see you all on day 20.